never forget the day I sort of dismissively got my first taste of Stranger Things. My fans know I'm not generally drawn to horror, but something about the aesthetic and the heavy-handed way with which Netflix was pushing it made me give it a try. The first season was made available July 15th, 2016, but I swear, though I haven't been able to confirm it, that Netflix released the first episode's cold open with the title sequence a day early as a little teaser. It's possible I only watched that much and then decided I should wait because I knew Julia would love it too. I can't be sure, but what I am sure about is that I still remember the rush the moment that intro kicked in for the first time. Waves of nostalgia to... well, to what? Before we go any further, no real specific spoilers for the show, although at this point if you're not already watching Stranger Things, I doubt you're watching this, and if you are, you probably don't care about spoilers. But let me convince you to watch it just on the merit of the intro sequence. Anyway, most of what I'll be talking about isn't anything more than you'd learn in a trailer, especially anything after season 1. What did you notice about the title sequence the first time you watched it? 80s synthesizer music, maybe the faux sparkle crackling like dust on a film negative, the jittery light flashes and flicker imbuing it with a presumably deliberate lack of polish, light awkwardly but still eye-pleasingly bleeding from the edges of the letters as they come together. You probably even recognized the font as 80s even if you couldn't quite put your finger on what it was exactly. I'm sure you realized quickly that this intro isn't about revealing anything specific about the show at all. There are a few things happening, but the main goal is tone. In short, you felt, I felt, everything the Duffer Brothers wanted us to feel. Pure nostalgia. I was only 5 years old when the 1980s ended, so is this show, this intro making us feel nostalgia for actual memories? I don't think so, and I believe that's the genius of this title sequence. The nostalgia isn't for anything real from the 80s at all, it's for 80s media, 80s movies, TV, book covers, whatever the zeitgeist has deemed 80s. That's where these sounds and images take your brain. Because you don't need to have been a kid in the 80s to have fond memories of Flight of the Navigator, Ghostbusters, Mad Max, Cujo, or more recently The Thing and Scanners. If you've been keeping up with our new series, Working Titles, you probably heard Sage from Just Right talk about how Batman, the animated series intro, doesn't even use words or a logo to identify Batman, or Patrick H. Willems talk about how shows used to have to hook their viewers while catching them up on the story quickly in case they entered halfway through a season. Stranger Things takes a different approach. We only get the title of the show because the Netflix anytime all-time bingeable content model has changed the purpose of the title sequence. We don't need to learn anything about the characters, the setting, or the plot. There aren't even any lyrics to give you a hint at what the show is about. And you might be thinking, hey, guy, it's all score. The visuals are neat, but without the score, it's nothing. The score is important, and I'm going to get into it, but the visuals are doing something to your brain that might not be as noticeable as the score. As we get into the show, more things about the title sequence reveal themselves to us. Things our brains noticed even if we didn't. Every season is set up with a new mystery, which is evident right after the first cold open, where we watch Will Byers disappear, as well as the episode title that really spells it out. But the visuals actually prepare our brains for the overall tone and genre of the show. We start in super close on hazy red bars and out-of-focus curves slowly moving away from the camera. Glowing hot spikes, shapes drifting apart, sliding together, and otherwise rearranging. We slowly recognize some of the shapes are serifs, which means letters. Specifically ITC Bengat, Stephen King's go-to font, but more importantly, our brains register them as puzzle pieces slowly locking into place to form one cohesive image framed by bars as the icing on the cake that are perfectly in time with the score. In less than 60 seconds, the first mystery of the show is already solved. It's a roadmap for the entire series. Each episode offers a revelation as another piece in the puzzle. In the same way that some letters don't fit together at first and then change shape to form the final title, some pieces of information only make sense once you've seen the entire show. Tell me your feelings on Steve didn't flip-flop over the course of season 1. Or, you know, that the show is only pretending to be a sizzle reel compilation of your favorite 80s movies when it's actually a deep emotional drama about family and loss and young love and parents' love for their children, the death of childhood. What was I talking about? Right. But the visual language doesn't stop at the title. There's an aesthetic similarity in the episode titles to both Altered States and The Dead Zone, both created by Richard Greenberg and both acknowledged by Michelle Dougherty, the creator of the visuals from Imaginary Forces, as inspiration. But it actually serves a couple other purposes for Stranger Things. If you've even overheard people talking about Stranger Things, you know about the Upside Down, Hawkins' name for their alternate dimension that exists in the same space as this dimension. We travel through the hollow letters of the episode title to the other side. The easiest interpretation is leaving our reality for the Upside Down. But since we're also leaving modern day behind, I love the idea that we're also traveling through time to get to this alternate 80s. One of the funnier things about this alternate 80s is that Michelle admitted that if she turned in the Stranger Things title sequence back in the 80s, she would have immediately been fired. You see, the 80s were a time when an intro like this would be filmed, as in with a camera and film. So little imperfections were an inevitability. Back then, minimizing those imperfections was clearly the goal. But now we're in the digital age where everything can be perfect. To make it too perfect would give away the truth. So Michelle and her team deliberately created errors like the burnout to pink of each credit, light bleed, and misalignment, all to mimic that aesthetic again, proving that this sequence is not a callback to the 80s, it's a callback to the 80s inside our broken, manipulated, and pop culture inundated memories. Overall, the show has a visual aesthetic that calls back to a lot of the movies I mentioned earlier, quite a few even cited as inspiration from the Duffer Brothers. But when you ask people what does Stranger Things remind you of, the majority of them will say The Goonies, E.T., or maybe Stand By Me. What I find interesting is that the score in the show, the thing most people would say is responsible for that feeling, doesn't call back to those scores at all. 80s coming-of-age movies mostly had orchestral adventure scores. Even the score to a movie with an unironically featured song in the show doesn't really meld with the tone of Stranger Things. The score instead pulls from the main themes of movies like Aliens and The Terminator, and most notably, a few different scores composed by Tangerine Dream. If there's a movie score from the 80s you love, there's a decent chance they were responsible for it. Each is pretty unique, like Legend, Firestarter, Near Dark, but the scores that stand out as apparent inspirations are Sorcerer, The Keep, and weirdly the movie responsible for making you think Ray-Ban Wayfarers are cool, Risky Business. So while the visuals are telling our eyes one thing, the score for the show, and particularly this intro sequence, are taking our adult ears and brains back to another genre entirely. Most likely to movies that our kid minds wouldn't necessarily be nostalgic for. And we're reminded of that every episode with this intro. Uneasy, full of mystery, a little sinister, a touch of terror. And even though I describe the track as subdued, it's also epic in its conclusion. Kyle Dixon and Michael Stein wrote the piece in addition to the rest of the soundtrack for the show. Clearly, I love the visuals and have shown why they're essential, but the score is pivotal to the intro sequence, and hot dang do I love it. Various people have broken down the actual structure of this song, so I won't belabor it, but briefly, it's in the key of E minor that's contrasted with the main melody being a repeated C major 7th arpeggio, which just means the notes of a chord played in succession. The opening little trill that you hear here is the main melody line a few octaves higher in double time. The unending arpeggio of notes running up and down the scale gives the whole track a fluidity. It never stops running, but it can't get away. One of my favorite things Kyle and Michael added is the heartbeat as the only real percussion keeping time on the one beat. They isolated heavily at the beginning of their Volume 2 extended edition. I actually took the song's pulse since, heartbeat, and came up with 84 BPM, but I've read a couple people say it's 82 BPM. Either way, a heart rate in the 80s is just about average for most healthy humans, so there's a decent chance you could feel the beat with your own pulse. Thematically, the song opens loudly featuring the heartbeat, and then keeping with the theme of bringing new things into focus, the main melody line overtakes the heartbeat and pushes it to the background. The song also ends with the heartbeat petering out, just skipping a beat, and then you can hear the valve open, but not close. Yeah, we're getting literal. That heart ain't pumping anymore. But back to the arpeggio. A fun new word I learned through researching this song is ostinato, which ultimately it just means the same collection of notes or musical phrase are continuously repeated. What that led me to learn about myself is that not only do I genuinely enjoy lots of songs with ostinati, when you have an ostinato of an arpeggio combined with changing bass chords, you create a sound that elicits completely different emotions without the notes of the melody line changing. More clearly, this phrase repeats exactly the same while the bass note chords change around it. And even though you hear the same notes in the melody, they take on a different meaning and feeling next to the bass chords. Again, a very easy parallel to draw to the show. Characters and allegiances and your perception of them all shift depending on what's going on around them, and depending on how they're presented to us. And a fun surprise for me, I found out that another one of my favorite intro sequences, Daredevil, has an ostinato combined with varying chords as well. It's an intro so good, I never skip it, even on rewatches. It's an intro so good, I bet good money that much like the 2 and the 3 from subsequent seasons, not much will change going forward. The only slight difference I've noticed so far has been a brighter version for Season 2, which further illuminates the grainy imperfection. And even though Kyle and Michael released a 5-minute version of the track for Season 2, there's nothing quite like the original at right around 60 seconds. It's 80s, yet it's also modern. In a weird way, Michelle Dougherty together with Kyle Dixon and Michael Stein, guided by the Duffer Brothers' vision, created a completely dated piece of work that is altogether timeless.